Good morning and welcome to the fourth meeting of the Public Audit and Post-Legislative Scrutiny Committee in 2020. Can public galleries please switch off their mobile devices? Item 1 is decision on taking business in private. Do members agree to take items 3 and 5 in private this morning?
Agreed.
Thank you. Item 2 is the Section 23 report on Scotland's city, region and growth deals. Can I welcome our witnesses to the meeting this morning? Fraser McKinlay, Controller of Audit and Director of Performance Audit and Best Value, Graham Greenhill, Senior Manager, Sally Thompson, Audit Manager, and Derek Hoy, Audit Manager, Performance and Best Value, all from Audit Scotland. I'm going to ask Fraser McKinlay to make an opening statement.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, members. The report you have in front of you today reviews the development of city, region and growth deals and their progress so far in enabling economic development. 4 city region deals have been signed to date, with a further 8 currently in development. £5.2 billion has been committed so far, with funding from the UK Government, the Scottish Government, councils and other partner organisations. City deals were first introduced by the UK Government in 2011 as part of its policy to devolve powers to local regions. In 2014, the UK Government and the Scottish Government announced the first deal in Scotland involving councils and partners in the Glasgow City region. The Scottish Government's decision to introduce deals in Scotland was in line with its existing policy on cities and economic growth. However, at the time, it wasn't clear how this programme would contribute to existing economic development policy, and clear and measurable objectives for the programme were not established. Deals represent a long-term funding commitment and bring additional money for regional economic development. They have enabled economic development projects to go ahead that may not otherwise have happened. Deals have also been a catalyst for increased collaboration and joint working. Not only are neighbouring councils working together more closely, they are also establishing valuable partnerships with local businesses, universities, the third sector and other external organisations. Securing a deal can be a lengthy and complex process. It's not clear why some projects are selected for deal funding and others are not, and communities have had little involvement in the deals. These factors limit the transparency and the ability to hold public bodies to account for their deal-related spending. All individual deals include output measures, such as new jobs created. But 5 years after signing the first deal, the Scottish Government has not yet set out how it will measure the long-term success of the programme, how it will assess whether deals are achieving value for money, or how the programme will contribute to the outcomes in the National Performance Framework. This means that opportunities for deals to contribute to the National Performance Framework may have been missed. Finally, Convener, there are also risks around the capacity of councils and their partners to deliver deals against a challenging backdrop for the public sector. Governance arrangements continue to evolve. It is important that these arrangements are kept under review to ensure they remain clear and effective. And as always, Convener, the team and I are very happy to answer the committee's questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr McKinlay. I'm going to ask Colin Beattie to open questioning for the committee.
Thank you, Convener. I suppose one of the most basic things here is to understand the criteria under which these deals are put together. Now, the Scottish Government's given some high-level guidance, as I understand from the report. Has the UK Government given any guidance? Does the Scottish Government's high-level guidance, is it in accord with what the UK Government's looking for, since they're the partner in this?
I'll maybe ask Derek to come in on that in a second, Mr Beattie, but just to start off, I think one of the things that we found in this report, exactly as you describe, I think, is that criteria for the deals are not as clear or as transparent as they could be. I think partly that's because the history of city and region growth deals has evolved over the years, obviously originating in England and then coming north of the border with the Glasgow one. And to be fair, we can see, I think, more coherence and more rationale, if you like, for the later deals as they've gone through. But I'll maybe ask Derek just to add to that.
Yeah, I think that's correct. There's certainly been progress made over the kind of 5 or 6 years or so of the deals. So some of the later deals, for example, Tay cities have followed more of a process, which is in line with some of the guidance that the Scottish Government have brought in through the Agenda for Cities strategy and the Enterprise and Skills Review Phase 2 of that. In terms of the UK Government's guidance, I think both governments have been working together. There are signs of that. There is evidence of that happening. They have a joint group called the Scottish City Region Deal Delivery Board, which is not the catchiest title. But so they work together to help the local partners in deals to formulate their ideas and to take the deals forward. In terms of actual guidance, there's not a kind of hard guidance in place in terms of a set process that should be followed. I think the general thinking behind the deals is that every deal is different, and every deal should therefore be developed in its own way based on the priorities that are in place in that particular region. So it's very much a process of negotiation. So there's not much, as Fraser said, in the way of hard evidence of how that process takes place. It's, it does lack transparency, and we don't really see exactly what goes on during those negotiation phases, but it's very much a process of negotiation rather than following a set process.
So, given what you're saying, the Scottish Government and the UK Government believe that by leaving it as a sort of an open-ended application process or deal process, that will capture a broader spread and opportunity of deals. Is that right?
I think that's fair to say, yes. I think that one of the possibilities that the Scottish Government mentioned, that if a very tight process is followed, is that opportunities might be missed. So if they don't give the regional partners their own opportunity to come forward with ideas and think about how they want to develop the deal themselves in the way that will benefit their region based on that region's priorities, then there is a possibility there that they might not realise the full potential of the deal. So I think that's the thinking behind it.
The high-level criteria that are being given, the high-level guidance that's been given, is that sufficient to ensure that deals coming forward are at least in some way comparable? In other words, if you're going to be judging between different deals, is there sufficient commonality in approach that they will be judged on a fair and equitable basis?
I think it's possibly too early to say that. I think that we'll find that out as the deals progress. So,
have been signed. Some of the deals are.
They have been signed, yes, but I think because of such a long-term programme, we won't really see the benefits of that coming out. So we wouldn't really know if that the way they've gone about the process will have worked for quite a while yet. Which is,
from a very simple point of view, if you're sitting in some sort of joint group with the Scottish Government and UK Government, you'll want to see some commonality in the process that's coming forward from a disparate number of people in the market. You want to be able to evaluate one against the other to determine which is the one to follow if a choice has to be made. Is there sufficient commonality in that approach? Is there sufficient in the guidelines and in the high-level guidance on this, criteria on this, to make sure that happens so they're judged fairly?
I think that's where there's a lack of transparency. It was quite difficult to answer that question. So without knowing the detail of how each deal is put together, okay, the high level guidance is in place, but I think to answer your question in terms of does that provide enough, it's difficult to say that. It's not. I think there's maybe a level beneath that we don't see throughout the negotiation period, and that's where those discussions take place about do the deals complement each other rather than put regions in competition against each other.
I think Graham was going to come in.
If I can just build on Derek's comments. It's very much up to the individual councils and other partners in each city deal to come up with their own ideas as to what should or should not be in their city deal. As Derek has said, the Scottish Government's view is that too detailed guidance could constrain that kind of innovative thinking as councils and their partners think about what might be in their proposal. The risk of that, of not having that guidance, is of course the councils and their partners coming up with deals which the government is unlikely to find suitable for their funding. So what our report is actually saying is that there is a need for the government to learn lessons from the deals that have already been signed so that they can pick up on good practice from the earlier deals and provide that as a steer for subsequent deals that are coming through.
Okay, let me just move on to another point which Fraser actually touched on. That's in connection with the capacity of councils to be able to support this, because they're obviously a key element in this all the way through. And we all know that certainly in my constituency, the economic development area is probably one of the first to be cut. Now, do you have evidence that councils still have the level of skills and expertise and commitment resources to be able to ensure that these deals are properly put together and managed?
Yep, I'll kick off and ask the team to come in. So we recognise it as a risk in the report, Mr Beattie, as you say, because as I know from the work that we do in local government, as you say, economic development is one of the areas that tends to be under most pressure in councils at the moment, and so there is a capacity issue there. I think I would also say, though, that the deals have in place some good and strong programme management office arrangements. So in terms of progressing the deal, we think that's, in generally speaking, in pretty good shape. But there's no doubt that if the city deals need to be genuinely plugged into local and regional approaches to economic development, then the pressure on economic development departments and councils could have a knock-on impact in terms of progress. Team, do you want to add to that?
Just to add that it's still early days, so I don't think we really have evidence to say that individual councils are under-resourced in delivering their city deals, but there is a risk there. Councils are adopting different approaches. Some have formed multidisciplinary teams to deliver the city deals. Others are, it's a very reduced number of people involved in delivering the city deals. So again, that's why we're saying councils need to keep the resources that they're devoting to managing city deals under review and to supplement them where necessary.
I guess one of the key things is it's not just resources, it's appropriate. So it's people with appropriate skills, because these city deals are rather bigger and more complex than much of what your average council economic development area will be dealing with. Do they have those skills, and could the Scottish Government assist in supporting them in that? And maybe they do. Maybe the Scottish Government does support them in that. Does it?
A lot of deals have used consultants where they haven't had resources, where they haven't had the expertise, and certainly what we've heard from people in councils is that a lot of the experienced staff have gone, so they do lack expertise in some things like developing detailed business cases and doing the economic analysis to assess the economic impact, so they've brought in consultants for that. But one of our recommendations is deals to learn from each other as they're going, because some work might be getting done in one area that could actually be applied to another. So there's a role for the Scottish Government to help sort of share that good practice. It is done on an ad hoc basis, but we think there's scope to improve that.
And just add, I think what's interesting about the different deals when you look across is that they've approached that and managed that risk in different ways. So in Glasgow, they've created things like the Economic Commission, which brings in experts from a wide range of places to advise the councils on the kind of regional economic situation in Glasgow. In Aberdeen, there's a much stronger private sector presence involved in the deal and actually sit on the governing board. So even where they are a bit stretched maybe in terms of experience and skills, I think the deals have done some quite good things to bring in expertise in other ways.
My observation on this has been the strongest deals have always been the ones with strongest political leadership, and the weaker deals have been those that have been primarily officer-led, because I think the clue is in the word deal. It is a political deal at the end of the day between the Scottish and UK governments, but it's just my observation. Alec Neil, you're next.
Yeah, I've got 3 questions. The first one is, if you look at the hype from all the parties involved in these deals and compare it to the reality, there is a big gap between that. I mean, if you look at the Glasgow deal, for example, it looks like a big number, well over £1 billion, but it's over 20 years. It averages out at £60 million a year. And even taking into account the multiplier, which is probably about 1, so even if you take into account the multiplier, while it's welcome, and I'm not saying we shouldn't do it, but putting it in perspective in terms of the Glasgow economy, and of course the Glasgow deal covers places in North Lanarkshire and places like that. It's not just confined to Glasgow City. So when you spread it out and look at it on a per capita basis, or look at it as a percentage of total public spend on infrastructure and economic development in the area, it's pretty minimal stuff, isn't it?
So I think that's a fair point, Mr Neil. I think, and to be fair, I don't think people involved in city deals would claim that they are the only show in town. They're not going to fix everything on their own. As you say, it's a welcome investment, and as we say in the report, some things have been able to happen that otherwise would not. I suppose that's why we think it's really important that the rationale for the choice of project is critical, because if you are getting this additional money, then you want to invest it on the things that's going to make the biggest difference in the long term. But yeah, you're right, the headline numbers look big. Our colleagues in the National Audit Office down south said exactly the same thing about the English City deals. They're big headline numbers, but when you spread it over 20, 30 years, obviously it's maybe not quite so significant. I think that's also why, though, we're keen to report on some of the spin-off benefits that we have seen. Glasgow's a great example where the 8 councils involved really are working together on lots of different ways in a way that I'm not sure they would have been doing otherwise. So there's the kind of hard benefit, if you like, of the money going in and infrastructure projects being built. But I think then there's also the wider benefit, which you can already see spinning off into other areas of more collaboration across the regions.
Be an argument for channeling much more of the resources available to the 3 parties involved, the Scottish Government, the UK Government and the councils, through the city deal rather than through other budgets.
I mean, it's interesting that whether it's funneled through that way or not, you can see evidence that the partners involved are beginning to talk about how they use their resources more collaboratively across the city region. So whether it's a kind of change in the formal mechanism that says you give the money to the city deal cabinet in Glasgow's case, even if it's not that, there's definitely, I think, across the country you can see more conversation happening about how collectively the partner organisations pool resources in a way that we probably haven't seen quite so much of recently.
And I think it's important to remember that deals represent a long-term funding commitment from both the Scottish and the Westminster governments. One of the things we often hear from councils is the difficulties they have in long-term financial planning, because they don't know how much money they're going to get from the Scottish Government beyond the 3-year period. We don't completely buy that argument, but city deals do represent a long-term commitment from central governments, which does provide a more certainty of funding towards the deals.
Potentially an argument for putting more through this mechanism than the other existing mechanisms. Can I ask, I mean, I don't see it in your report, but in calculating the economic impact of any programme, 2 factors that need to be taken into account are deadweight. Would it have happened anyway without these programmes? And displacement. In other words, the money that's getting channelled into this programme, is it displacing other programmes that now will not happen because of a reallocation of resources? And particularly during a period of tight budgets, displacement is quite important, as indeed deadweight is. So from the work you've done, in terms of estimating the economic impact of these programmes, how big a factor is deadweight and how big a factor is displacement?
Again, I'll ask the team to come in on that. I think just to say, we haven't done any direct work ourselves on the economic impact, but what we have done is look at the extent to which the deals themselves have been looking at that. And as Sally mentioned, there's been quite a lot of activity around that, and absolutely we would expect those economic impact assessments to include deadweight or additionality and the displacement effect, Mr. Neil. So,
the value for money, you need to look at the impact.
Indeed.
Economically. For every pound spent, as it were.
Indeed.
So if you're not looking at deadweight and displacement, how do you calculate value for money?
Is an excellent question, and in fact we've concluded that you can't really make an assessment of value for money at the moment on city deals because that evidence hasn't been presented. Team, Sally?
When deals have been agreed, they've been agreed along with output measures which will be based on the economic analysis. So additionality is one, new jobs is another, added GVA. So they're all slightly different, but they're generally like looking at these kind of things. But they're quite limited, and they don't look at the wider impact. So they don't look at the bigger picture in terms of what impact they'll have on the wider economy or on communities and things. So there's a lack of links between the output measures and the national performance framework. There's a lack of links between them and outcomes that they would like to achieve. So that's one of the things we've recommended is addressed in terms of
Just
that.
by the way, you recommend as councils and Scottish Government. I understand your remits in Scotland and it covers councils and Scottish Government. But surely the UK Government, and I don't think you even comment, the UK Government should be doing the same thing in terms of its function in Scotland. And I realise within your remit it might be difficult to do that, but you don't. But maybe even a reference to say, you know, they should be following this. Agreement needs to be reached with them anyway.
Yes, so as you say, as we explain in the report, we can't really comment on the UK Government because it's out with our powers, Mr Neil. But what I would say is that our colleagues in the National Audit Office have done, I think, 2 reports in recent years on city deals in England, and they have made exactly the same points. So they have covered the question of the extent to which the UK Government is evaluating in the way you've just described the impact of the deals. So that has been covered by colleagues south of the border.
Although it's a recommendation, is it actually being implemented?
I'm afraid I couldn't tell you at the moment. I haven't followed that up south of the border.
Because, I mean, there's a Treasury guidance on how these outcomes and outputs should be measured, so it's not as if they need to reinvent the wheel.
So what I would say is that there is an interesting difference or tension, I think, in I guess what the UK Government has been about and what the Scottish Government has been about. And actually this came up in, I think, the Local Government Committee's review of this a couple of years ago when the then Cabinet Secretary and the UK Government Minister were in front of them, where the UK Government policy was all about devolution, it was all about localism, they called it back in the day, and it was also about economic growth. They were clear about that. The government's approach is about inclusive growth. And so actually the way in which you measure those two things are quite different. So the approaches you would expect to take, and this is the point we make in this report, is if the Scottish Government and councils are saying that city deals are about inclusive growth, then you need to create a package of measures that define what that is and actually measures whether the growth is indeed inclusive or not. The approach down south is a bit different. They are generally more interested in pure economic growth. So there's an interesting tension in some of that, I think, north of the border.
So heavy on inclusiveness. Can I just finally ask you one other question? You say under source of funding, section 6, the report indicates that sorry, it's not in your report, it's quoted from the report. The report indicates that the UK Government's funding for deals is additional to the block grant provided to the Scottish Government. In other words, it's out with the devolution settlement. Is that right? So is the position with this, if the Scottish Government and councils don't agree to UK demands, if I can put it that way, in relation to these projects, they wouldn't get this additional money that's in addition to the annual settlement between the Scottish Government and the UK Government? And is it within the jurisdiction of the fiscal framework?
So there's a few things in there. If I'm understanding the first part of your question, I think yeah, if they can't agree the deal, then they don't get the money.
No, that's not what I'm asking. No, I'm not asking about if you can't agree the deal. What I'm saying is, in principle, if the Scottish Government didn't do this, would they still get that money? So supposing the Scottish Government said, look, rather than spending money in city deals, we want to spend this money on the road programme, for example, would they still get this additional money?
I'm not sure we have the answer to that, Mr Neil. Graham?
It depends on the projects which are advanced in the city deal. The Westminster Government has said that they will only fund projects which relate to reserved matters. If the city deal comes forward with projects which aren't covered by the Westminster Government's responsibilities, then the Westminster Government won't provide the funding towards that deal.
I don't understand that, because as part of the city deal, for Glasgow, the A73, nearly £200 million is earmarked and agreed for upgrading the A73 road. Now, that's clearly a devolved matter. Roads are a devolved matter. And yet the city deal money is, I welcome it. It's a great boost for my constituency. I'm not complaining. But it's certainly not a reserved matter.
Sorry, I was just going to say the UK Government sort of clarified, if you want, their position after the Glasgow deal was funded. So the Glasgow deal sits slightly differently to the other deals. So after Glasgow, the UK Government were very clear that they would generally only fund devolved matters. But even at that, there is a bit of flexibility.
Only the UK Government would reserve matters,
sorry.
you mean?
Sorry, yeah.
Right. So how then do you work out, if this is a deal and it's all the money's going into one pot, do they say that the money spent on the reserved areas has to match their contribution? Because that's what you're saying.
So that's the principle, yes. So, but this is, I guess, I come back to the
So
point we
what
make
kind
in
of
the
reserved matters are they going to are they spending money on in the later post-Glasgow deals?
So I'll maybe ask the team to come back to that. But I guess my main point on this, Mr. Neil, is that it's not very clear. So this is the point we make about the transparency, both of how projects are decided, as you say, once the money has been agreed amongst all the partners, how that money is then divvied up and spent on individual things, and then how that's reported back. And I guess there's a wee tension in there, because I guess what we wouldn't necessarily want is for the pot of money, as you say, to sit with lots of little pots inside it with no flexibility about how you spend all of that. The benefit has to be from the whole. But at the same time, the two different governments, and for that matter, the other parties, have a range of different interests and different things we're looking to get from it.
I think we need to clarify, you know, part of our follow-up with the UK government, possibly exactly, you know, what the position is here, because the danger is if the UK government is funding devolved matters and making it a condition that people in these deals do certain things, then that is totally contrary to the devolution settlement. If they're saying we'll come in and we'll fund only reserved matters, then clearly that's a different proposition. But we need to see, you know, and be able to trace how much is the spending and is it going into the right areas and so on. So clearly the transparency issue is a very important one. Okay, thank you.
Anas Sarwar.
Good morning. I suppose it's kind of connected in some kind of loose way to Alec Neil's questions. I wanted to focus on the collaboration and the working together part. Most often our public discourse, at least, is one of battles between the UK and the Scottish Government. Could you set out a bit more around how the collaboration is working between Scottish and UK Government, and whether it's still generally positive, and what lessons that may draw for other areas as well?
Sure. Sally?
I think across the board, everybody has reported good working relations. That's at council level and at national level and with wider partners. As part of the audit, we have spoken with the Scottish office that was, and obviously the Scottish Government, and they both report good joint working relations, and deals when they're working with working with both governments to develop deals, report good relations. So yeah, there seems to be good, strong collaboration.
And is your sense that the Glasgow City deals, as one example, or indeed all the city or region deals, are not trying to undermine the devolution settlement, but rather demonstrate how working together at different layers of government, whether that be local, Scottish or UK government, can help drive investment and growth and hopefully employment in cities and regions across Scotland?
So I don't suppose we make any judgment at all, really, about what this tells us about the devolution settlement, one way or the other. So
To clarify, I'm not asking you to comment on.
Sure.
What I'm meaning is it's not taking powers away from that devolution settlement. It's actually using the different powers that they have to try and drive some investment, hopefully, into the cities and regions.
I mean, there's no getting away from the fact that the birth of city deals in Scotland came at a very particular point in time, in 2014, in the run-up to the independence referendum, and as I think the Cabinet Secretary at the time said to the Local Government and Communities Committee when he was giving evidence, the process was that the UK Government announced some money and the Scottish Government didn't have a lot of time to respond to that. I think what they've done well then is build on that, recognise that as an opportunity, learn the lessons from the Glasgow deal, as Sally's already said, and as we say in the report, as you go through the time, as a, excuse me, the other deals have been agreed, you can begin to see more coherence and more and a better plan, I guess, for how those work. And as Sally says, the relations do seem to be working well. So, I mean, in terms of the lessons to draw from that, I think, for me, it's about having a clarity of shared purpose and objective. There's no doubt that the money helps. Having relatively significant amounts of money on the table does tend to focus minds a little bit, I think. And I think what's been good is that it has allowed councils, governments and their partners really to focus on a shared sense of purpose for the region. So from that perspective, I think there probably are some good lessons to learn, both about working within regions and, for that matter, across the border.
So politics being politics and politicians being politicians, a lot of the discussion and debate is around one government is committing X, you know, as a competition of another government committing X alongside that. So despite what looks like at times being some kind of competition between two governments and a battle between two governments around who can give the biggest check, you still think that those that are actually running the city and region deals, those that are on the ground, the civil servants, etc., and the councils are still working collaboratively well.
Yeah, our evidence is that's working well, and you know, I absolutely recognise the convener's observation earlier that at some level this is a political process, and we're not critical of that in any way. I think that doesn't or shouldn't preclude more transparency in the process, and that's why we've recommended that. But no, as Sally said, in the kind of level of actually trying to make these things work, we can see lots of good cooperation and collaboration.
Good, and it's not just UK versus Scotland. There's obviously probably some local authority over the years competition as well. How's the local authority to local authority relationship working? Is there, for example, a risk? Because I know this was a fear at the start of the Glasgow region deal, that Glasgow City Council would become the focal point and everyone else would kind of be an add-on. But I think the sense from people is that it's worked quite well and collaboratively. Is the sense that the local government to local government relationship is a good one?
I'll ask Sally to come in, but I guess my reflection is, and we do say in the report, that when you speak to some of the people that are closely involved in getting the deal over the line, particularly in the latter stages, it can be a pretty tortuous process. And a lot of that has to do with, as much as the kind of national government position, as you say, it's actually about different councils, concerns that we're going back to kind of regional structure. All of that stuff comes into play. But actually they've got through that and they've worked well with it, I think. Sally, to that?
I think at council level, at like councillor level and officer level, there's been evidence of a lot of good joint working across the councils. The councils sort of, in some areas like in Glasgow, they divide up responsibility for different themes, so it's not just Glasgow City Council that does it all. So like even East Dunbartonshire, I think it is, it doesn't actually have a project. It's still very positive about the deals. It can see the benefits of the deals. It's involved in the governance. It's involved in the decision making. So it's very much a deal process. And in the Edinburgh deal, for example, the elected members see the benefit of getting round the table and talking about things. So although they're only meant to do that, I think it's maybe once a quarter, they actually do it they do it monthly. So they actually are proactively wanting to meet because they can see the benefits. As we say in our report, it is obviously early days and it's not led to any kind of reform of services per se, but they can see that the sort of collaboration and they can see the benefit from talking.
That was my next question, Sally Thompson, around services, because obviously while it's not being connected to the city regional deal, but getting local authorities around the table and working together in collaboration, is there some seeds or some shoots coming off collaboration and service delivery in other areas as well, as councils face budget pressures, as there's wanted to have a consistency of approach in terms of service delivery across different parts of Scotland? Are you seeing more collaboration out with the city and regional deals as a result of the city and region deals getting local authorities around the table?
I think there are some examples of greater collaboration out with the actual city deals. So, for example, the one we quote in the report is that the Glasgow areas come together to decide how to distribute certain pots of funding that are not directly city deal funding. So there's that kind of element. I don't think we've got any evidence that's led to any sort of service delivery change yet. It's quite early days, I think.
Yeah, as Sally says, I think it's a work in progress. Some of the more longer-serving members of this committee will recall that we have brought reports on roads maintenance to you a couple of times over the years, and in those reports we have spoken about some of the challenges associated with sharing services and collaborative working. As Fraser says, money tends to focus minds.
Just on the money, taking the Glasgow deal as an example, 1.2 billion, I think, over the course of all the deals, we're talking many more billions than that. But when compared to Exhibit 6 in terms of the actual spending year to year, it seems like we badge these mass sums of money as a way of promoting it as a concept, but actually the spend is relatively small year on year. In terms of the commitment that the governments have made, is that a commitment in terms of money has been allocated in future years' budgets, so that money is put aside, or is that just at the moment just a broad wish list and commitment without backed up in terms of hard cash?
So I would maybe characterise it somewhere in between. So it's certainly more than a wish list, but we would definitely like to see it built into medium and longer term financial planning a bit better. And I think one of the risks that we identify in the report is, particularly for councils, having a clear mitigation strategy for if the money doesn't materialise, and there are different levels of risk depending on which deal you look at. So, you know, in some of them it's very public sector driven, so you would expect that to come, although we would like it to be built into medium-term financial planning more clearly. If you look at the Aberdeen one of the interesting things about Aberdeen is there's a much bigger private sector contribution. Now, clearly, if something were to happen and the private sector were to turn around and say, actually, priorities have changed, we're not going to give you that money, then that gives the North East deal more of an issue. So we're keen that the deals recognise those risks and are taking steps to mitigate them as best they can.
Thank you. And just a last question around, going back to the collaboration, sorry for a second. Take the Glasgow Airport Rail Link as an example. So that was announced as some fanfare many times, but in relation directly to the Glasgow City deal, in 2014, obviously it was an announcement. There's been several changes of the project and announcement since. We don't have a firm proposal on the table, although we have money allocated to deliver it. Is there something built in when there is a clash on a project to try and find a resolution? Is there some kind of system built in to resolve that? Going back, so that goes back to, in some sense, to Alec Neil's point, is the money committed only if everyone is 100% agreed and on the same wavelength, or is there a way of conflict resolution to make sure we still have investment coming in?
Again, I'll ask Sally to come in, but I think the governance arrangements in the city deals are absolutely critical for that. And one of the things we think is in pretty good shape, albeit early days, is the governance arrangements that we describe in the report locally are pretty well established, we think, but they have yet to be tested in exactly those kind of circumstances. But I think that would be the route by which any disagreement around specific projects would come. And there's no doubt that just because a project is in a deal, it's no guarantee that it will actually happen. Sheriff Hall out towards where I live, out towards East Lothian, is clearly a controversial project. That's in the Edinburgh South East Region deal, and there's a long way to go in that. So there's no guarantees, I would say, but I think the mechanisms are there to try and manage that. Is that fair, Sally?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think the national governments and the local deals are clear that because they are such long-term timescales, that some things will change and that they'll need to keep an eye to try and maximise the impact from their investment. But so in terms of the Glasgow rail link, I think everybody's still committed to improving access to Glasgow Airport, and the same amount of money is committed to it. And they still want the same economic impact from it, but the actual the best way to do that is still being discussed through all the various structures.
Thank you.
Bill Bowman.
Thank you, Convener. If I can sort of go back to what Colin Beattie was saying, and just to clarify on the resource question. For example, in my North East region, say Dundee and Angus, where the councils have difficulty maybe emptying bins, fixing swings and play parks, yet they're now having to put resources into working on a deal. Are you saying that the Scottish Government can do more or should do more to help councils with these resources in some way?
I don't think that's what we're saying explicitly in the report, Mr. Bowman. I think councils have a lot of different things to juggle, as you say, from those kind of direct service areas that you've described through to supporting this. And I think what they have recognised is, as well as dealing with the short-term pressures of service delivery, they have to invest for the future. Team, do we have anything else to say in terms of that specific question?
The Scottish Government are not providing any additional money to councils to allow them to manage the city deals.
Yeah, and people, no?
Yes, no, nothing
Neither.
like that. It's entirely up to the councils, and obviously the councils will then have to balance the development of their prospective city deal with all their other activities and functions that they perform.
So in your report, I think paragraph 30, you talk about the external consultants that are being brought in most deals to help. Are they bringing in just skills, let's say modelling, or are they bringing in expertise, people who have some experience in putting together a deal? I mean,
I think generally Really sort of expertise. They're bringing in sort of specific skills around about economic modelling. There will be some assistance for bringing a deal together, but bringing a deal together is where it really lacks the transparency. So it's not clear, but generally there's a lot of input from both national governments and the councils work together to develop a proposal that is acceptable to everybody. In terms of the resource impact on councils, developing a deal can take some councils a long time to do, and it's quite a lot of resource. So one of our recommendations that we think will help that is if the Scottish Government can help share good practice about this has happened, this has worked well, and that deals can learn from each other to make that process more streamlined, because that's where a lot of work does go in at a council level.
From you looking at the various deals, do you have a feel for a commonality of consultants or some firms developing expertise here that they will then go and sell to more than one council, shall we say?
I think a range of people have been used, to be honest, is our understanding. There's been some big national audit firms used and some sort of local economic specialists used. So I think it's quite varied, I think.
Also the Scottish Futures Trust they've been assisting some of the later deals as well to provide guidance in terms of how to put business cases together and those sorts of things. And I think they've been particularly valuable for the smaller councils or the smaller deals where there is a bigger draw on their resources. So that's something that's come across later on. And I think we heard from some of those councils that they'd be quite grateful for the role that they've played in helping them to pull the deals together.
Councils involved know the support that is available.
I think, again, that's something that's improved over time. So maybe some of the earlier deals were feeling their way a bit in the dark and weren't too sure where to turn for guidance. But as things have progressed, then I think that both governments have played a better role providing guidance themselves, and in terms of signposting to bodies like the Scottish Futures Trust, and also signposting later deals to earlier deals to find out how they went about doing things as well. So that's improved slightly over time. I think there's still some work to be done on that front, and there could be a better role perhaps for the Scottish Government to play in pulling together different deals to share information and to share learning. But I think there has been some progress in that, at least.
In councils, if they ask, they do speak to each other and are open about their experiences.
I think early on they were maybe less open about it because they might have felt there was a degree of competition, so they might have been kind of keeping things close to their chest. But I think, again, latterly, I think as it's become clearer how deals come together and they realise that there's not really that much of an element of competition, that they are a bit more open with each other and they are speaking to each other more.
I think the only thing I would add, Convener, is that we are obviously moving into a different kind of phase on this now. So there has been a lot of activity in getting the deals signed and almost signed. The big challenge now, of course, is delivery. And so I think the kind of skills and capacity requirement in the first 5 years of the story, if you like, getting the deal signed is one thing. We're now in a different phase, and it is worth remembering, of course, that we've talked about economic development, bits of councils. Councils do have a long and pretty decent track record of capital programmes anyway. So to some extent, the programmes that are happening in these areas are capital programmes that councils are used to managing for many years. So there's a kind of skills and capacity thing there that kicks in, that isn't just about economic development, but it is obviously about actually getting the things built for the ones that are infrastructure based. I think the interesting ones in a sense will be, the likes of Edinburgh and the South East, which isn't actually quite so much about infrastructure, but is much more about skills, data, digital. The role that the council and the partners in there need to play is quite different. It's about facilitating, it's about ensuring that things are progressing at the same time. So I think as we move into the delivery phase, the different deals will require different kinds of skill sets, and that's why we've kind of seen in the report that people need to really recognise that and put in place the skills and capacity that they need.
Thank you.
Fraser McKinley, following on from Bill Bowman's question, Bill was pursuing a line of questioning saying, do councils recognise what support's available? Do you actually think there's enough policy making capacity available at Scottish Government level on this?
I'll ask the team to help with that one, Convener, but I guess what I would say, and I think what the report sets out, is that the policy backdrop for this is pretty complicated. So I think if you take a step back and look at the economic development landscape, it is quite busy and evolving quickly. So we now have, for example, the South of Scotland Enterprise Agency as a new kid on the block. We make the point, as indeed colleagues down south did, that the city region deals might make sense as an economic regional area, but doesn't necessarily map across to other administrative areas that people are working with. So I think both locally and nationally, there is quite a lot to work through. So I don't think it's a question of there not being enough capacity, but I do think there's a need to better articulate how city deals contribute to the whole. That's why we make the point, I think, quite strongly in the report about the link to outcomes in the national performance framework. It is a bit surprising that the city deals don't mention how they will contribute to the outcomes that are in the national performance framework, and that seems to us a gap.
Too, but who's in charge of city deals for the Scottish Government?
So ultimately it sits with the accountable officer in the appropriate bit of government, who is Liz Ditchburn.
Okay, so she's the go-to person on city deals.
Ultimately, the Director General, I've forgotten what her formal title is, Graham, but the Director General for Economy and Fair Work is the accountable officer for city deals ultimately.
And that's her?
Yeah.
So is there quite a lot of expertise in that, presumably built up over these deals? Is there quite a lot of expertise in that team that can go into the most recent deal and say, right, okay, well, we've learned lessons on this deal, we would advise you to do it this way, blah, blah.
So,
is that what happens?
So I think there is a lot of expertise in government around the deals. I'm not sure they would necessarily do the thing you've just described there in terms of actually going into individual deals. But again, I'll maybe ask Sally to pick that up.
I think as deals have evolved and the governments have worked with the increasing number of deals, they do share what's worked well with a deal. So they will make recommendations. For example, I think Murray's trying to develop a deal and looking to get more business input, so they would try and help them with that. So they do that, but they don't do it. It's done sort of on a more ad hoc, or it's less transparent way, because that's all sort of part of the negotiation and the dealings. But there's quite regular communication between national government and the deals. They have annual conversations, but they also meet sort of out with that and sort of talk about progress and how things are going and what the risks are. So there is quite good communication there and assistance, I would say.
Willie Coffey.
Convener, a few questions I have, Fraser. Firstly, I wonder if I could ask just about the audit scope, if you don't mind. I mean, my view of the growth deals, particularly from an Ayrshire perspective, is a pretty positive one. And I just thought the report was a wee bit on the negative side. So who did you have in your audit from Ayrshire? The advisory group membership? Was there any Ayrshire voices in there making a contribution to your findings that you've presented in the report?
Not on the advisory group. On the advisory group, we only had people from the deals that had been signed, because those are the deals we were looking at in more detail. But we did speak to people from Ayrshire, from the Ayrshire Growth deal, to get their view on how things were progressing there.
You did?
We did, yes. Yes.
Do you include MSPs in your your methodology? I don't see MSPs being consulted about their views on this. You've asked elected members, but what
we didn't. No, we didn't speak to any MSPs.
Is that something that you might choose to do in the future with things like this? Because there's surely MSPs would have a view on some of these major impacts in their communities.
I think that's an excellent thought. Mr. Coffey will definitely take that away and look at it. Yep, thank you. We can think about that for the future.
Thank you. On the Ayrshire deal itself, I think it's been a pretty positive experience. I think Derek made a remark earlier that initially the three councils in Ayrshire might have had a little bit of vying with one another for projects and so on, but it was largely ironed out, I think, and I think the proposal that we have in front of us is a pretty good and a pretty strong one. Both governments do have a say. I think they're coming to them from different angles, of course. The UK government with its industrial strategy focus, and the Scottish government perhaps with the sustainable, inclusive economic growth focus. But I do think both governments had a view on the kind of initial project lists to have a look at these. I don't think it was as rigorous as devolved versus reserved. I don't think it was as rigorous as that. It was fairly mutually cooperative, I think, and which led to the signing of the deal, I'm glad to say. But just picking out one of the local projects that I mentioned from time to time in here, the Halo project. It's worth £63 million. It's not all funded from the growth deal, but its components are looking at leisure, education, culture, commerce, fuelled by renewable energy. It's contributing, they hope, £200 million to local GDP, supporting 1,500 jobs, delivering long-term sustainable economic and social benefits. Now, what more should the Ayrshire growth deal have put down on paper to satisfy Audit Scotland and the concerns that you've raised today?
So I suppose the concerns we're raising in the report, Mr Coffey, don't relate to individual projects. We say, I think, in the report that things have happened that would not otherwise have happened. I think our question mark, I guess, in the recommendations we're making for government and for councils is to be clearer about how projects are chosen, how the funding is directed to those projects, and then what we are expecting to get as a result of those things. There is, of course, an opportunity cost with all of these things. So for choosing to invest in one infrastructure project, that's money that isn't going anywhere else. And that's the bit that, from our perspective, is difficult to see. We're not in any way suggesting that there isn't good stuff happening here. I think what we're saying is there's more that I think government and councils can do to really demonstrate how it's going to make the difference in the long term, beyond some of the output measures that Sally mentioned earlier.
Again, though, I mean, you spoke to both UK and Scottish Government officials, I presume. Did they not give you some kind of indication of what their criteria for selecting or supporting, or perhaps not supporting, some of the projects that made it to the final list actually were? They must surely have.
Yeah, not so much. It's
Did
kind
you
of,
ask?
yeah, well, yes, we did, and that's why we say it's not clear, because they don't. Now, to be fair, and particularly in the UK government side, and again, I would refer to the NEO report that was published in 2016, the UK government at the time was deliberate in saying we're not going to worry too much about how the deals compare across the country. They deliberately made a choice not to evaluate all the deals together, because it was all about localism. It was all about devolving power, they would argue, to those local places. I think the Scottish Government's approach has been slightly different, and we spoke earlier about the reasons for that, which were to allow, in a sense, 1,000 flowers to bloom, to encourage innovation, to make sure that the projects coming forward were genuinely meeting a need and aspirations of those local communities. And that's absolutely fine. And it does mean that when we, or more importantly, people in those communities come along and say, why did you choose that project and not that project, it's not very clear.
Beyond the growth deal investments, I mean, whatever period of term they last, and the sustainability of whatever projects do emerge, has there been any thinking about that, whether they will continue to need these kinds of levels of funding to sustain them, or will they become self-sustaining? Is there any sense of that within any of the deals across Scotland?
Again, I'll ask the team to come in there, Mr Coffey, but I think one of the points we're making about maybe the difference between outputs and outcomes is you need to be clear, once you've, let's say for the sake of argument, built the thing, whatever that thing is, you need to be clear how then that's going to contribute to economic growth beyond the point of that thing being built. So the funding won't be there because the thing has been built, but it was built for a purpose, and I think that's the bit we struggled to get a handle on. Graham, is that fair?
Yes, yeah. And there is the beginnings of talk around the kind of second phase of city deals, but the government is committed at this stage anyway to ensure that every part of the country is covered by a city deal or a growth deal before it starts to move into city deals too. And there's also emerging thoughts around the idea of a green city deal, where the investment is much more targeted towards projects which will reduce emission levels.
Well, that would chime with the plans and proposals within the National Investment Bank strategy. But in terms of, just last question, Convener, just in terms of your own follow-up from here on in, when will you kind of look at it again? At what point do you think it might be appropriate to have a little look at progress with all of the deals?
Yeah, we do have plans to do that. When's it in the programme for at the moment?
It's a couple of years' time. We will see what happens with this report. Couple of years' time will give some time for the other deals that are currently in preparation to be approved. It will also give the deals which have been signed a bit more time to move into that delivery phase. So that's a proposal that will come back in a couple of years' time.
Recommendations in here, how would we get sight of progress towards the recommendations that you're making? Shall we just write as a committee and ask both governments for an update and the councils for an update? Is that the mechanism we would choose to? Because I don't think we want to wait 2 years as a committee to have some sense of an update and progress with these.
No, we've always got the option to take further evidence on this, which we may well decide to do. Do you want to address that point, Mr McKinley?
Only to say the committee, I was going to say the same thing, convener, the committee will want to decide whether you want to write and or have an evidence session, as well as a follow-up report. In time, we would always routinely do what we call an impact report, which is really just doing a bit an exercise to see the extent to which the recommendations have A, been accepted, and B, then actually implemented. We make those publicly available and send them to the committee. Anyway, we tend to do that between 12 and 18 months after the publication of a report, which is a shorter, sharper piece of work, which isn't a follow-up audit as such. It's really just a check-in to see how those recommendations have been made. So I think between your own efforts and ours, we would have a good sense as to whether the recommendations are being implemented.
Great, thank you.
Fraser McKinley, the whole purpose of City Deals is about generating economic growth, creating new jobs, new business opportunities. So in my mind, a lot of the projects and opportunities have to be current, they need to be cutting edge, they need to be competitive. But we've got the situation in the Tay-Cities deal that started planning quite a few years ago now. So some of the projects were conceived 4 years ago, and it looks like they won't be funded for another 6 years. So you've got a 10-year time lag before a project that was conceived now 4 years ago was deemed to be economically beneficial. Now, I understand that the timescales for this, you need long-term investment, and us as politicians always argue for that. But for a 10-year time lag for a project that's supposed to be cutting edge and competitive to start, what is your take on that?
I think that is a risk, convener, and as I think Sally mentioned earlier, I think people involved in the deals recognise that the content of the deals may well change over that period, partly for exactly the reason you've just described. It's interesting when you look at the graph that we have in the report somewhere, if I can find it, the team will help me, the one that shows the pattern of spend over the period. Exhibit 6, thank you, Derek. Exhibit 6 on page 30. You can see that the expectation is the bulk of the spend will peak around 22-23. So I think people recognise, and indeed I was noticing that the director of the Glasgow deal in his blog just a couple of weeks ago was saying that they're trying to accelerate quite a lot of the work in Glasgow to recognising, I think, partly the risk that you've mentioned, convener, which is the longer you leave these things, the longer you're not getting the benefit of them, and I guess the greater the risk that they might become out of date. It does seem to me that will largely depend on the nature of the project. So some of these things are a bit more future-proofed, I guess. But you're right to raise it, and I think that's one of the things you would expect the governance arrangements to be looking at as they are getting into the delivery phase.
But governance arrangements are pretty poor. That's right, isn't it?
No, I wouldn't say they're poor. I think locally, I think what we're saying is they're untested. So I think when it comes to some of those difficult decisions potentially about what's in deals, those have still to be made. I think the governance structures are sound and they're all in place, particularly at the local level. I think nationally, I think everyone would recognise that that's taken a wee while to get going, and they really only formalised that last year, Derek, I think. But locally, the joint committees and steering groups are in place, and the kind of monitoring of progress that they get, we think, is in a pretty good place.
Let me ask you a wee bit about transparency, because this is certainly something the media focused on when the Auditor General released her report last week. I think there's been a lot of confusion on the City deal at local level, why one project is funded and not another. And indeed, some of the people putting forward these projects have been quite surprised themselves. Do you think, I mean, clearly your report says there should be more transparency around this process?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So let me give you an example. Should some of it, would it be funded within the normal infrastructure programme anyway? Let me give you an example. So one of the last projects to be identified as will be funded in the Tay-Cities deal was a bridge at Scone. And that came as a surprise to some of us in Dundee, but, people in Perth were quite happy with that. But should it not be funded just under the normal infrastructure programme anyway?
So there's no doubt that one of the questions that's been raised around City deals since their inception is the extent to which stuff would have happened anyway. and the extent to which some of these were projects that councils had wanted to do for quite a long time but didn't have the funding. I guess I would say it's quite difficult to unpick some of that. And again, I think you can see an evolution through the history of the deals. But I'll see if the team have anything to add to that. Derek?
Yeah, I think in terms of, I think it's fair to say the majority of projects that sit in all the deals are projects that were already, or had already been thought of and were maybe waiting for funding to come along for them to actually go ahead. But maybe what the deal has brought has been a degree of time additionality, so it's allowed it to happen sooner than it would have done, or it's maybe happening at a greater scale than it would have done, or there's a greater level of synergy between that particular project and other projects that are going on. So there are various different types of additionality that the deals bring, but it's fair to say that a lot of the projects were already in place.
It just raises questions about the criteria, doesn't it? Because, correct me if I'm wrong about this, but the local government published a report on city deals 2 years ago now, and the Leavenmouth Rail project hadn't been included in the Fife Edinburgh City deal, but of course we know now that the Scottish Government have stepped up and put funding into that project. So it wasn't good enough for the cities deal, but Scottish Government have now, for whatever reason, decided to do it. And other projects have gone the other way. They've not been funded under the normal infrastructure programme like the Scone Bridge, but have found themselves in the city deal. So it raises questions about the criteria for decisions on funding.
Yes, it does.
Can you expand on that, Mr. McKinney, for me?
So I'm struggling to know what else to say, Convener, because yes, it does, and I think, I mean, we're not just as Mr. Coffey mentioned, and as I said in response to his question, we're not at all looking to be critical of individual projects and what they might bring. I think what we're saying is it isn't clear, particularly to local communities, why some things are out and some things aren't, why some things are funded separately by Scottish Government, and we can see more of that. Interestingly, there is more Scottish Government funding being put in round about city deals, and again, we're not critical of that, but I think in terms of a clearer set of criteria, a clearer understanding for people in the partner organisations and the communities they serve is an important part of the equation, we think. We mention, we haven't touched on it too much yet, but we do mention the fact that there's been, as far as we can tell, very little community engagement in any of these deals. We actually do mention the Tay Cities deal as one that tried to do a bit more as one of the later deals, but the earlier ones, there's very little at all. It's a series of projects that appear, and we had really very little evidence that local communities had any kind of ownership of these things.
Graham?
I was just going to pick up on one of the things the report talks about is the need for the government to better articulate how the City Deals programme relates to the National Performance Framework, and the outcome, the Scottish Government, relates to the National Performance Framework, and the outcomes came in that, included in that. If it did so, then that would allow the City Deals proposals to better reflect what kind of outcomes are expected from the city deals and the projects, and that provides the beginnings of a framework to allow selection criteria to be exercised over individual projects.
Yes, because this isn't about transparency for transparency's sake. It's about transparency so communities can then better plan further economic growth, isn't it? Can I ask you about, finally, about something that's intrigued me for a while? The whole thing about power transfer. So the cities' deals have always been, when they started in England as well, about investing, but also about transferring power to the cities and regions that were managing that money. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, Fraser McKinley, but I think we saw in Manchester when the cities deal was signed and stuff, you had the transfer of power, you had the mayor's position created, a lot more local power. Am I right in saying that no power has been devolved from the Scottish Government to local authorities in the process of Scottish city deals?
That's correct, Convener. The starting point is quite different. I mentioned earlier that the UK government in 2011, it was very much part of their localism agenda. And as you say, for example, part of the deal was the city mayor model was a requirement, in fact, of getting the money. Now, I'm not sure that was straightforward actually for lots of local authorities. That was not an easy thing to sign up to, but the model in Scotland has been quite different. I remember, again, I think it was at the time of the Local Government Committee's inquiry back in 2017, I think Glasgow and Edinburgh, not Edinburgh, Aberdeen councils made a pitch for that kind of devolution of power to come with it. That hasn't happened. So at the moment, city deals are really about getting the local partners together to deliver the projects that are in the city deal and no more than that.
And why hasn't that power transfer happened?
It's probably a question better asked of the Scottish Government and potentially COSLA. It seems to me that it kind of was never really part of the discussion in Scotland, and I think there's probably a lot to do with the history of local government in Scotland as opposed to England and how all of that works. But I'm not sure I have the answer to that for you.
Because just to be clear, if we're going to draw comparisons with the power that was devolved in, for instance, Manchester, that power to Scottish local authorities isn't to be devolved from Westminster because it's already been devolved to Edinburgh. It would be a devolution from Edinburgh to the local authorities. Is that correct? Because apart from tax, which actually through the accelerator models and other models has already been a bit devolved from Westminster to local authorities in Scotland.
So I'm always a bit cautious of drawing too many direct comparisons between how it works south of the border and north of the border because the starting points are quite different. So what local authorities do and the makeup of local authorities.
For instance,
where
would that power be devolved from?
In Scotland?
Yes.
Well, I guess technically, if we wanted to create mayors, then that would be an agreement, I guess, between the Scottish Government and COSLA. But as I say, that's not been the history or background in Scotland, and I'm not aware of any appetite to move in that direction.
Okay, thank you. Apart from Aberdeen.
A couple of years ago.
Okay, Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. I'd like to go back to the Convener's intervention earlier on around the structures and something you said earlier, Graham Greenhill. Your report describes the role of the Scottish City Region Deal Delivery Board, which is, as I understand it, it's the main national governing body for those deals which have been signed. It consists of senior civil servants from both governments, and its job is to scrutinise performance and the budgets and the risks and that sort of thing. But you also say that its role is still evolving, and that certainly you give a specific example at paragraph 40 of somewhere where its role is not clear. Does this not give you some significant cause for concern, particularly given the sums involved in the scope of the deals?
So I think the point we're making, and I'll maybe ask Graham to come in, is particularly in relation to not clear is the role in evaluating the impact. So I think we can see it playing a role in progressing and agreeing the deals. But as I said earlier, we're now moving into a different kind of phase. We would absolutely have expected more formal arrangements for that group to have been agreed sooner than they were. As we say in 41, that was agreed finally, formally in writing in 2019. And I think everyone recognises that could have been done earlier. So I think what we're interested in now is the extent to which that group is fulfilling a role more almost like a programme board to ensure that the deals are actually progressing in the way that they're supposed to do. And there's no doubt that the governance and accountability arrangements around those between the individual deals and the national picture is going to be quite complex, and we'll certainly be keeping an eye on that. Graham, anything to add?
I don't think I could really add an awful lot. As Fraser says, it's essentially a timing issue. In the early days of the board, it was all about getting city deals off the ground. Clearly, going forward, once we move into that delivery phase of projects, focus and attention needs to be more directed towards, are these projects actually delivering the impact that was originally thought of them? So there is action there required of the board to clarify these kind of issues as to what its role is in respect of that evaluating the impact of deals.
That being the case then, is there, when you've assessed it, is there any particular specific expertise on that board? I mean, something that this committee is always concerned about is the right people doing the right jobs. I mean, is there a specific finance expertise? Is there an economic bent to any of the particular characters, but also related to that, Graham Greenhill, if you say that the role is fundamentally changing as we progress through this timeline, does that mean that the personnel will be changing as well to make sure that expertise is always there?
Can we help with who sits on the board?
So who sits on the board are the senior officials from both the UK and the Scottish Government who are responsible for city deals policy. They sit on the board. As I've said, the role of the board, it's changed its name over time and it's kind of evolved over time. And it's now looking to look more to how they will evaluate deals. So they're the people that sit on the board. Whether they'll bring other people in, I don't actually know.
I think the interesting thing for me in that is the relationship between the joint committees locally, the programme management offices locally, and then that top level board. And there's a couple of interesting things in there. One is that some of those governance committees locally are, of course, elected members. They are joint committees under the Act and so are accountable to local communities officially. So the reporting line between that and a national body of civil servants is an interesting one that we'll want to keep a close eye on. But I think for me, the skills that you're describing there, Mr. Kerr, really need to sit at the deal level. So at the national level, people need to be able to obviously understand progress and hold to account and ensure good governance around the use of the money. And of course, you'd need people with finance skills in order to do that. But I think there is something about ensuring that the right skills are at the right place.
But sticking with those skills then, do you know if any considerations, we talk about various civil servants being on this board, and I've no doubt they're very highly skilled, but given the significant private involvement that we've heard about, in such as the Aberdeen deal, do you know if any consideration has been given to getting a more diverse composition of the board, such as those from a commercial or business background?
Do we know?
So we don't know.
I don't think we know. We can try and find out, Mr. Kerr, if that'd be helpful.
That would be helpful.
Yep.
Thank you.
Sure.
Do members have any further questions for Audit Scotland on this report? Okay, can I thank you very much for your evidence this morning. I now close the public part of the committee as we move into private session.